Hey everyone, I'm Pastor Mike. So I decided to put together this video because about 20 years ago, a little bit less than that maybe, I was going through a time in my life when I had a whole lot of extra free time on my hands. And because I didn't really know what to do with it, and I had access to a computer, I ended up going on various online forums and just getting into debates with atheists. Now, this is that time around the early 2000s where everybody was online debating everybody. And I got hooked on it and I ended up spending probably 10,000 hours over the next 10 years or so debating atheists back and forth and other people, other religions, other people, even other Christians on different topics. And over time, I came to the conclusion that uh, people seem to be approaching the debate wrong. There's a flaw in the debate as a whole, the way it is framed, the way people address the issue. And I've spent time, reading atheist materials, listening to their podcasts, then watching debates, then reading the materials of theists, where they made their arguments against atheists and their books and all this stuff. I've kind of looked at the whole picture for a long time, and in spite of this, I still feel that there's kind of a mistake in the process here, and I haven't heard anybody else address it, so I decided I'm just going to make a video on it myself. All right, so if I was to summarize the atheist approach to the God debate, I could put it down in three sentences. The first sentence is uh, the the individual that is making a claim has the burden of proof. So that is the first line in this three-part syllogism here. The person making the claim has the burden of proof. Point number two, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. People that are familiar with the four horsemen of the atheist apocalypse, they know that phrase fairly well. And then finally, the third line is the only type of evidence that is valid, that is acceptable, is scientific evidence. So the theist is the one that's making a claim that God exists, so the burden of proof is on them. The claim that a God exists is an extraordinary claim, so we need extraordinary evidence. And there's only one kind of evidence that ever qualifies as legitimate, and that is scientific evidence. And this is more or less the atheist trifecta here. This is the even if somebody doesn't outright state it, this is how a good majority of atheists today think when they approach the whole debate on the topic. Okay, so usually when it comes to theists, there's three ways that theists have responded. And one is to actually provide arguments. Now, these arguments are obviously not scientific, but theists insist that they're legitimate arguments anyway. These are the cosmological arguments, the fine-tuning, the ontological. Sometimes you bring in the resurrection and whatever other types of arguments. There's probably, I don't know, maybe 20, 30 altogether if we're gonna unless we put them into categories, then obviously there's only a lot less. But whatever the arguments are, one approach is the one used by apologists, which is to come up with a list of arguments and to insist that there is evidence for God. Now, there's another group of people who basically have taken kind of a defeatist approach, and they say, look, I can't really prove God exists. It's not something that can be proven. So, I take it on faith. It's just my experience. It's my truth. Other people take a presuppositionalist approach where they say, hey, you have to start with the presupposition that the Bible is true, or maybe some other holy book, and go from there. And their whole thought process works from that angle. So anyway, this is kind of an alternative way to approach the whole debate. And finally, something kind of interesting and novel in a sense, but in another sense, it's also highly debatable, is the approach taken by Alvin Plantinga, which is to say that belief in God is properly basic. And the way his argument works is to say that we have an innate sense, kind of like a sixth sense, or like this other ability inside of us to sense the divine in some way, and people all over the world have it. But because of sin, some people have lost this, so that's why atheists exist. But the majority of people have it, and they have it before they're even aware of it. So they're born with it. It's something we're all born with, and it's part of our normal functioning faculties. So just like, if you open the door and you see a dog running towards you, you don't sit there and think, is this a real dog? Is this an illusion? Are my mental faculties working correctly? You just see the dog, you realize you're in danger, and you close the door, right? Well, Plantinga says that that's a properly basic belief. It's just the way we normally react when we sense different things in our environment. And we also have this innate sense of divinity, and that's just a normal belief, and we should treat it as a properly basic belief. And because of that, we don't really need like additional arguments or evidence. It's just something that we're free to believe, because that's how we're, it's something we're born with, or however else you want to say that. So anyway, that's that version of the argument. So most of the people approach the topic from one of these three perspectives. Okay, so what I would say, however, that there's a prior step before we even get into any of these things. So before we appeal to any of these three options, there's a prior step here. And what I would say is that there's actually a flaw in the logic of the atheists to begin with. And because they approach things from this flawed perspective, they frame the conversation in such a way that it just creates an uneven situation where it makes things a lot more difficult on our part if we don't confront this flaw, if we don't address it. So whether the thing is explicitly stated, so the atheist makes his case the way I've explained at the beginning, and then we have to respond to that particular framing of the debate. But even if they don't state it, it's how they think. So what happens is, when we present our arguments, they don't land for the atheist, either this atheist or any other atheist that's listening. Then the arguments are just bound not to connect, because the way the issue is framed in their mind is flawed. Okay, so the question is, why is it flawed? Where is this coming from? And I'll propose that it's coming from all the way back to the Enlightenment, and with René Descartes, and with the way the whole foundationalist approach to philosophy, the way it was set up. So when Descartes introduced his kind of new approach to epistemology, which came to be known as foundationalism, it happened to coincide with the scientific revolution. So this was about the same time in history where people were starting to understand the scientific method, and they were starting to understand how science works, and they were actually seeing results, and they were seeing progress. And philosophers of science and philosophers in general, they kind of joined forces in a sense here in developing this new approach to epistemology that had this sort of foundationalist tint to it, or however you want to say that, which meant that they started to think like this. They started to say, okay, let's start with the most bare minimum of starting assumptions, where we don't assume anything except things that we absolutely have to assume, and then every piece of knowledge after that is something that we can demonstrate scientifically. And once we've done it that way, then at least we know that the little bit that we know, at least we have confidence that it's correct, as opposed to saying we know a whole lot of stuff, and then a century or 2 centuries down the line, we realize we were wrong and we have to start over. So there was this sort of metaphor that was adopted at this point in history, where people started trying to think of knowledge in terms of this very basic, very minimalist foundation, and then everything from there is scientific. It came to be known as positivism, and anyway, there's a whole lot of history of philosophy after that. But there's a problem with this kind of logic, and so let's kind of trace it together, just kind of follow the way Descartes was thinking about this, and how subsequent people after Descartes came to think about this. So Descartes said, I could question pretty much everything I believe. My entire belief system at this point in time, I could question every aspect of it, all the way to the one most basic element, which is the question of whether I myself exist. And they concluded that, look, in order to be able to doubt everything, at least I have to be there to doubt it. So one thing I know for certain is that I exist. Everything else I could question, but I know for a fact that I exist. So to Descartes, that became this indubitable foundation, this one thing that cannot be questioned, it cannot be knocked down. It's an absolute fact that I at least exist. I don't know about you. I don't know about everybody else. I know that I exist because otherwise I couldn't be thinking about it, right? So to him, this created this foundation for philosophy, and people kind of ran with this idea. Once they came to understand this concept of a foundationalist epistemology, they just ran with it. But obviously, Descartes said that there could be an evil demon that is kind of it's confusing me about everything. So I know that I exist, but everything else, it could be just an evil demon playing games with my mind, where I think there's a world around me and I think there's other people, but maybe there isn't. It's just an illusion. It's just a dream. It's just something that, in the modern world, we would say maybe we're in a matrix and I'm the only person in the matrix and everything else is an illusion that is built around me to make me think I'm in a world, right? So those are the problems with Descartes' approach. And the solution to this was just to recognize that there's a set of properly basic beliefs that we all have to accept. So we have to accept the fact that there's other minds, and we have to accept that the world is real around us. This is not just an illusion. There actually is a world. There actually is something out there, and there's other people out there. So we treat this as properly basic beliefs. But once we have this bare minimum of beliefs, everything else from there can be scientifically developed, and then we can call it knowledge, because at least we're confident that it's correct. So, since that time, it's been hundreds of years since that time, people have moved on from there, and they recognize that there's serious problems with this in general. In the world of science, people like Thomas Kuhn are probably have been attributed to have developed this new trajectory and so on. But that's outside the scope of this discussion. But within this way of thinking, there's an even more primordial problem here that it seems that most people just overlook. And it's this idea that if I allow for the fact that I exist, and then I allow for the fact that other minds exist, and that the world around us exists, and these are things I have to allow for to be able to justify doing science. Because if all these are an illusion, then who cares if science works? It's all an illusion, right? It could just be a game somebody's playing on my mind, right? So we have to allow that these things are there. So we have to treat them up as properly basic beliefs and then do everything else afterwards. Well, the question is, if these things exist, where did they come from? So where did I come from? Where did other minds come from? Where did the world come from? And the answer to that question has to also be seen as a properly basic belief as well. So you cannot have just these elements as properly basic beliefs on their own. The explanation for why those things exist is also properly basic belief. And people seem to have overlooked that fact, because you can't just take these elements as brute facts of reality, like, well, we exist and that's it. No, if they exist, there's a reason why they exist. There's some way by which they came to exist. And that also becomes a component of this properly basic structure of beliefs. So the question then is, how did these things come to exist? And the answer is that there's basically three possible hypotheses if we organize the hypothesis in such a way as to exclude any middle options. So the three options are basically this. The one option is what atheists typically think, which is naturalism. So everything that came to exist through some natural process all the way from whatever beginning there might have been. The other option is theism, which is that there's some kind of mind that always existed that created these things. And then there's whatever in between there is. So the option of other, so if we're going to say it's not naturalism, it's not theism, the middle option there, the other option, can be defined as non-theistic supernaturalism. So it's not natural, it's supernatural, but it's not God, so it's non-theistic. So there's this third option, non-theistic supernaturalism. But these can be viewed as the three hypotheses that include all possible hypotheses here. And unless unless we can either prove one of them or disprove two of them, then we have to take them all three as a package deal, because what else are we going to do? We don't know. If we don't know for sure, and we cannot demonstrate that naturalism is the correct hypothesis, then all these three hypotheses are the three options that we have to work with, and they become, as a package, properly basic beliefs. So alongside the structure here, all these different components that we take for granted, the fact that I exist, the fact that other minds exist, and the fact that the world exists, we have to also take for granted that one of these three options is the cause of the existence of these other elements. Okay, so how do atheists respond to this kind of thing usually? So one of the ways they approach this objection is to say that you don't understand the definition of atheism. In other words, as an atheist, I'm not here to say, I'm not here to propose some alternative for why things exist. All I'm saying is that I don't believe God exists. And be that as it may, it doesn't really change anything here, because whenever somebody takes up the question of God's existence, they have to recognize that God is one hypothesis out of three possible hypotheses that address the existence of everything else. And to even mention scientific evidence, we have to already assume all these other things are true. And in order to assume they're true, we have to assume that they came to exist somehow. So this is a typical response of atheists. They will often point out to or try to explain to us what atheism means, but it has nothing to do with this debate. If somebody wants to question God's existence, what they're doing is they're addressing one out of three possible hypotheses for existence. Another way that atheists come at this is to say, no, the natural is the default. So we can take for granted that the natural is true, and then you have to prove the other two. If the supernatural or if God exists, those have to be proven. The natural is the truth, because we all accept the fact that there's a natural world. If you walk around and something falls out of the sky, you don't think it's magic, you don't think it's supernatural, you think it just fell out of a tree, or if it was thrown by somebody or whatever. So we explain everything naturally. That's the default. Now, the thing is, natural might be the default in how we go about our life, but naturalism as a hypothesis cannot be the default, because we cannot prove that. We don't know. We don't have any way to know that it's true. So naturalism, theism, or non-theistic supernaturalism are three hypotheses. None of them are proven. None of them can be treated as a default, because there's no reason to know that one is true over the others. Obviously, the Occam's razor might come up here. I'm actually not going to get into that, because it doesn't really change anything here. The only real default here is that we don't actually know which is true. So we don't know is the default. Naturalism is not the default. Okay, and the third way that atheists respond to this is to assign probabilities, and they'll say, well, okay, be that as it may, let's say there are three hypotheses. It's way more probable that the naturalistic hypothesis is correct than the God hypothesis or the supernatural hypothesis. So they might take that approach. And again, what is the basis for that? How would you determine what is more plausible? The only thing you have based on which to determine which of the three hypotheses is more plausible is the nature of reality itself. So let's say we studied our universe for the next 5,000 years, and we understood everything from beginning to end, then we could say, yeah, maybe this hypothesis is the most plausible, because we understand everything that there is to know about our universe, and the explanation for our universe, we can deduce that because we understand what is needed. But at this point, we're definitely nowhere near that point. So we have no basis for determining those probabilities. But even if the atheist feels that there is a reason to assume the naturalistic perspective is the one that's most probable, in that process, the atheist is assuming a burden of proof, because now they have to demonstrate that option is more probable. And they cannot just sit by and place the entire burden of proof on the theist. So the framing of the the debate has been changed as well if it becomes a question of probabilities. So what does this all mean? Is that in almost every debate between theists and atheists set up the agenda in such a way that the theist is at a handicap. They're running a race, but they're starting 500 feet down earlier than where the atheist is at, for whatever reason, whether it's acknowledged or not. That's how atheists think about this whole debate, and that's why we're always talking past each other. And all that stuff is a flawed rationale. The logic behind it just doesn't work. And we got to acknowledge that, if we're going to frame the discussion correctly, we're not starting at any kind of disadvantage. We have a level playing field, and then we could go from there. We could discuss arguments, we could discuss whatever we want, but the discussion is starting on an equal level. And most importantly, this has to be done before we discuss anything else. I mean, if we cannot get past this point, then any further discussion is pointless anyway. So let's address this issue, come to a consensus here, and then we could talk about other arguments, other evidences, anything else we want to discuss, as long as we recognize that we're on a level playing field. Okay, so that's more or less what I had to say on this. Let me know what you think. Let me know if this is a valid point. I've never really heard anyone address this before. And it might be there. I just haven't come across it. Other people might be saying this. I don't know. I haven't heard it before. But it seems to me that there's definitely a flaw in the logic here. And I think this is important, not just because we want to win debates with atheists. That's not the point here. It's important because of the way the atheist perspective has affected society. For the past several centuries, it has impacted education, it has impacted philosophy, and especially science. Atheism has kind of dominated the scientific community, and it's because, I would say, a flawed epistemology, and it has affected many other things as a result. So I think it's worth taking this into consideration and addressing this one issue. Thank you for listening, and I would love to hear from you.